we have hundreds of species of pollinating insects, everything from the familiar butterflies and hummingbird moths to the more underappreciated flower flies, wasps, and longhorn beetles. But the most indispensable pollinators, and the topic of tonight's presentation, are none other than bees. So most of us are probably acquainted with these two familiar faces, the honeybee and the bumblebee. In fact, they probably form the basis of most of what society knows about bees in general. But these are not the only bees, not by a long shot. There are 20,000 different species of bees in the world, and over 3,500 here in North America, north of Mexico. Our humble Massachusetts hosts around 380 known species. I also quickly wanted to point out these incredible photos here on black background that you'll see a few more of in this presentation. They are from the USGS Native Bee Inventory and Monitoring Lab, and they're all in the public domain. So I highly encourage you to go out and check out their Flickr page and see more of these incredible pictures of our wild bees. So I'm sure I don't need to expound about the importance of pollination to our food systems and wild ecosystems to a group such as yourselves. Most of you have probably heard before about how bees make 1/3 of our food supply possible, and how even things like coffee or chocolate wouldn't exist without pollinators. But the contributions of native bees in that equation has been grossly overlooked. The pollination value of native bees is estimated at over $3 billion a year in the US. But it's not just about money, it's about results. So research has shown that native bees are better pollinators of some of our most important produce over honeybees. Things like apples, cherries, blueberries, and melons. Native bees are more efficient, needing fewer individual bees to get the job done, and they're more effective, yielding more and bigger fruit, because of the diversity of ways that bees move around on a flower when looking for pollen and nectar. Some of our crops, like blueberries and tomatoes, need to be buzz pollinated, which honeybees are not capable of doing. So let's look for a moment at some fruits that are important to New Englanders: blueberries, cranberries, and apples. The privilege of having these comes from native bees. Our blue orchard bees, mining bees, digger bees, and even this unassuming bee here in black. Melita americana has no common name, and it's one of many, as we'll learn in this presentation, that we know next to nothing about. It lives in cranberry bogs, and it helps make our classic Thanksgiving dinners possible. We receive these services from native bees for free. We don't bring them to our farm fields, care for them in the winter, and give them everything they need. They are vastly underappreciated, and it's thought that if farms provided more natural habitat for native bees, there'd be enough of them around that, at least for some crops, we wouldn't need to use honeybees at all. So we really should be thinking more about native bees, because in general, it's not a good idea to be reliant on a single species to do such an important job. So let's meet one of my favorite crop pollinators, and I hope this summer you'll all go out and try to look for this one. This is the squash bee, Eucera pruinosa, or you might see it written as Pepinapis pruinosa. So if you have squash or pumpkins in your garden, or if you're a farmer that grows squash, you almost certainly have this bee. They have an uncanny ability to find new patches of squash, which is good because their entire lives revolve around it. These bees nest in the ground near squash plants, and the females seek out squash flowers at dawn, long before honeybees are up and out of the hive. By noon, they're already all done for the day. Males don't have anywhere to live, so they actually sleep inside the squash flower. So open up a flower and you'll likely see one looking out at you, just like this picture that I took. It's thought that these bees actually expanded their range across North America because of the planting of squashes by indigenous tribes, making what was once a pretty uncommon plant available everywhere. But pollination is much bigger than agriculture. We know this. Ecosystems rely on pollination, and for more than just flowers. It means the reproduction of plants, plants which are themselves food for countless other species, and that produce seeds, nuts, and berries that wildlife depend on. It means brush for animals to hide and nest in, and it means wood and leaf litter where microorganisms cycle our soil. The products of pollination form the physical structure of the natural world and the resources for almost all forms of life. By extension, that includes the ecosystem services like clean air, carbon sequestration, and erosion control that we get from the environment. You'd be pretty hard-pressed to find a terrestrial ecosystem on Earth that's not touched by pollination in some way. Even aquatic habitats, apart from the deepest hydrothermal vents, are still at least partially dependent on energy and matter that enters the water from someplace on land. So needless to say, pollinators are worth paying attention to, and they certainly deserve our respect and appreciation. So the life cycle of a bee is one that we all seem familiar with, at least the basics. Bees visit flowers to gather pollen and nectar, in the process pollinating those flowers. And they'll take that back to their nest to feed their young. That's the foundation, but at that point it branches off in many directions, firstly being how they actually collect that pollen. So most bees have a dense brush of branched hairs called a scopa. Most often this is on the back legs, either on the femur or the tibia. And depending on the family or the genus, it might also be under the abdomen or somewhere else on the body. They'll brush all that pollen that gets onto them into the scopa, and that's where it'll stay for the rest of their foraging trip. Some bees don't have any pollen collecting hairs, and they'll appear mostly hairless. They'll eat the pollen, store it in their crop, and then regurgitate it back into their nest as sort of this nice protein slurry. Then we also have the corbiculate bees, which here in the northeastern US, those are represented only by the native bumblebees and the non-native honeybee. So instead of a brush of hair, their actual leg is flattened and expanded, forming a surface that pollen can stick to after it's been wetted with nectar. That's known as a pollen basket or a corbicula. So seeing a bee with this sticky pollen loaf attached to its back leg is a surefire way to know that you're looking at either a honeybee or a bumblebee. Or if it's empty, you can actually see that wide, flat hind leg.